All right. I know it's been a while. I've been a little busy. Just wrapped up a semester where I had an internship and had a bunch of closing classes because I will be graduating in August, almost a full year early. But y'all did not tune in to hear about my personal life. Y'all tuned in to hear about what I had to say about the NBA Finals. And the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Indiana Pacers are both in the finals. Two teams that have not been there in over a decade. The Thunder in 2012 and the Pacers in 2000. And it's a really, really cool time in the NBA. We're seeing more parity than we ever have. And this will be our 7th different champion in a row. But today we're going to talk about how these teams made it and how it was a decade in the making and how one game set this all up. This is Son of a Sports. Let's get into it. Okay, for most of this video, we are going to talk about the moves that each franchise made, what led them to getting to this point, and all of that. But first, we have to start with the butterfly effect that led to them getting to this point. And that's Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals during the 2015-2016 season. As anyone that's watching this knows, this is Kevin Durant's last game as a member of the Oklahoma City Thunder. This is where the Oklahoma City Thunder blew a 3-1 lead to the 73-9 Warriors. And yeah, I think most of you remember this series. Kevin Durant struggled significantly past Game 4, and Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant failed to close out the Warriors before the Warriors came back. And it was a fun series. It was a great series, and it determined the next decade of NBA basketball. As people remember what followed this, Kevin Durant going to the Warriors, Russell Westbrook being alone in the Thunder, the moves that were made after, and we'll still talk about that. And as everyone knows, the Warriors winning the next 2 championships following this season, the Warriors having the rings that they had, the Warriors' success that they would have, all of that had dominated the NBA over the next 3 seasons Kevin Durant was in Golden State. And then the Warriors and the success they have continued to go on until 2022, where they won the 4th ring in this run with Steph Curry. The move that Kevin Durant made almost a decade ago is still affecting the NBA to this day. And let me tell you why. A lot of people will argue that this is the trade that led to everything happening now, and I won't disagree with any of those people. Oklahoma City, after the 2016 season, decided to trade Serge Ibaka, their 3rd best player, and their best defender, one of the best defenders in basketball, to the Orlando Magic for former number 2 overall, Victor Oladipo, coming off his 2nd season in the league, and then the rights to number 11 overall, Domantas Sabonis. You know that name. You know who he is. And yeah, Oklahoma City realized Kevin Durant's a looming free agent. He was not happy with the offensive firepower they had during those playoffs and thought they needed more help outside of him and Russ. Well, they took their best defender and traded him to get Victor Oladipo, who showed signs of good shot creation, good three-point shooting, good defensive on-ball defense as a shooting guard, and could give them some help. And this was all in hopes to re-sign Kevin Durant, which, as you all know, and as I've already mentioned, didn't really work out. How did the next season go for the Oklahoma City Thunder? They finished as the 6th seed in the West, and obviously, Russell Westbrook did Russell Westbrook magic. If you remember Russell Westbrook for one thing, remember him for this season. An MVP of a 6-seeded team was something that was not really seen. I think it maybe happened a few times in NBA history at this point, but it was a big deal early in the season over the fact that, I don't think we saw this since Michael Jordan in the 80s, actually. I think that's the time that they said it was a big deal. He averaged the 2nd triple-double in league history. He had the most triple-doubles in a season in league history. He took a very flawed Oklahoma City roster with a Victor Oladipo that was still pretty raw. Steven Adams, who, great center. A very poor showing in his cancer. Andre Roberson, who was very offensively flawed and not that good of a bench. And they were a playoff team. Without Russ, that team is top of the lottery. And Russ averaged a triple-double, man. They were special. But it was clear he needed another star on that roster. Okay, what about our other team in the NBA Finals, the Indiana Pacers? Well, all right, we got to go back to the 2016-2017 season because that's where this all starts for them. Paul George is still on the roster. He's about 2 to 3 years removed from his serious leg injury. He made the All-Star team in 2015-2016 and was back to his regular self, improving again. The athleticism still wasn't fully there, but everything else in his game was still taking off. Paul George in 16-17 was, the athleticism was back. Not fully. The guy was doing 360 dunks and was still capable of them, just not doing them as often. and relied on the other parts of his game, becoming one of the best three-point shooters in basketball, one of the best defenders in basketball. Paul George was special, and he had to put on a really strong showing towards the end of the season to get the Indiana Pacers to the playoffs as the 7th seed in a, I'd say, more competitive final seeding in the Eastern Conference, especially with the Bulls catching up on them and Jimmy Butler having to put on a bunch of shows. If you watch my Nostalgia Basketball video, you know both Paul George and Jimmy Butler had really strong showings to close out this season to get them to the playoffs. And the issue is with the Indiana Pacers this year, they got swept immediately by the LeBron James-led Cavaliers. And I think every game was close. And if you go look back and watch my video or go look back at those playoffs, they were competitive games. The Indiana Pacers had like a 36-point lead over the Cleveland Cavaliers in one of those games. And LeBron and the Cavs, without Kyrie, I think they decided to just not play Kyrie in the second half, actually came back and I think it was the largest comeback in NBA playoff history at that point. At least one of them. And the Pacers looked defeated. Paul George kept saying, I need to take the last shot in these games. And he just didn't sound like he was confident in their future in the final presser. Well, Paul George was going to be in a contract year the following year, and he wasn't interested in signing an extension and re-signing in Indy. And Indiana was interested in a rebuild at that point. They had a lot going on. They had so much changes over the last almost half decade in George's early years that it just felt like time to move on. George said his preferred destination was his hometown team and the team he grew up loving in the Los Angeles Lakers, who recently brought in Magic Johnson and Rob Pelinka to lead the charge as on their front office. George also was interested in other contenders, but didn't specifically name anyone else other than the Lakers. With that said, there were a few teams interested: the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Boston Celtics, and the Houston Rockets. Boston offered a deal where it would be 3 of their own firsts or 3 firsts that weren't the Brooklyn firsts from the Paul George KG trade, and Jay Crowder and another unnamed starter that was never mentioned. Cleveland actually agreed to a deal with Indiana, and that included the Denver Nuggets in a 3-team trade that sent Kevin Love to Denver, Gary Harris in the 13th pick, who would later become Donovan Mitchell when Denver traded that pick to Utah during the draft, and they'd send him to Indy, and then Indiana would send Paul George to Cleveland. That was a deal that was actually agreed to, and Indiana backed out of at the last second as they were hesitant to send George to a team in the East, especially a team that just beat them in the playoffs. Another thing to note here, there was another deal on the table before the Cavs fired their GM and David Griffin, where George and Jimmy Butler would get sent to Cleveland. And I'm pretty sure at the time, Kyrie was not included in that deal. We never know the full details of that deal, and it was mostly a rumor after Griffin was fired, but that was a big rumor at that time. With all that said, Indy had to make a move, and George was going to be on the move. And yeah, as we all know, Paul George was traded to the Oklahoma City Thunder for Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis. Russ made it clear to the front office he needed a running mate to take this Oklahoma City roster to new heights, the heights that they hadn't seen in a half decade, take them to the finals, be a competitive team, especially in the West that just saw Golden State sweep through until they made the NBA Finals, and where they won the NBA Finals in 5 games. So Oklahoma City was spending that whole week before free agency looking to make a deal for Jimmy Butler and Paul George. Jimmy was traded draft night, and Paul George was traded a few days later to Oklahoma City for Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis, 2 of the guys in the package that Oklahoma City got a year before then for Serge Ibaka. Oladipo had a strong season in Oklahoma City, showing shot creation, averaging 16 points per game, showing strong 3-point shooting, and strong on-ball defense. Sabonis showed flashes here and there, but he was still a raw player. But Indy was getting 2 young prospects back for Paul George. I'm pretty sure at the time they were criticized for this deal and not getting a pick in return for a guy that was the face of their franchise for half a decade. And then Depot took off in Indiana. That 2017-2018 season was special for Victor Oladipo, where he was an all-star, an all-NBA guy, a finalist for Defensive Player of the Year. He was one of the top steals guys in the NBA. I think he had identical stats to Paul George, which was really ironic and something a lot of people brought up that season. Victor Oladipo was special, and I'll talk about where he took Indiana in just a second. But this was a shocker because in OKC he was good, but just no one really saw the star potential. They saw elite role player potential there. And in Orlando, I mean, that last year there, he showed clear improvements, but they were benching him for a lot of that season and not really playing him as often. And every year in Orlando, he improved and improved. But you have to remember, people, Orlando was a very, very unserious franchise at this time and made a lot of dumb decisions. and this is one of them. But yeah, in Indiana, Depot took off. His efficiency was the best of his career. He averaged 23 points per game, 2.5 steals per game. He was incredible. He was downright incredible and took Indiana to the playoffs and actually took the LeBron James-led Cavaliers, albeit a worse Cavaliers team, to 7 games and was going toe-to-toe with LeBron in that series. He was absolutely special in Indiana. And yeah, I mean, talking about the rest of his tenure there, looking at it, it wasn't perfect after that. That season was the peak of it. The following season, Depot played only 36 games before a serious injury happened. But even before then, he had declined. His play had declined from the previous year. His efficiency was not as good as it was the previous year. His defense was not as good as the previous year. His points per game fell by 5 points. He just wasn't the same player. I think he was still in consideration for the All-Star team. He might have made it, but he was not the same player. And even then, he still had a horrific injury that impacted the rest of his career. And his time in Indy came to an end the following season, I believe, when he decided to request a trade and asked to be sent out to Miami, but they included him in the 4-team trade that was the James Harden trade. Houston sent Harden to Brooklyn. Cleveland sent Jared Allen, or Cleveland got Jared Allen in that trade. Houston got Victor Oladipo. Indiana got Karis LeVert. It was a big swap around, and that's actually the deal that saved Karis LeVert's life, if you remember the heart condition that they found in Karis LeVert's physical. With all of that, Depot was sent away from Indiana after 2 seasons, but Indiana was still making moves, as Domantas Sabonis was another guy that became an unhidden gem and became an all-star for Indiana. Sabonis' progression really started the year Depot went down. Sabonis was a 6th Man of the Year candidate. The Pacers still held on strong, were 5th seed in the East to finish the year. Bojan Bogdanovic was a really good, I think he was the main player on that team at that point. Miles Turner was a finalist for Defensive Player of the Year. And they were a strong roster and were able to come in the playoffs as a 5th seed. They still lost in the first round, but they were still a good team. They still felt like if Depot could come back himself, that they'd be a strong team. Going into the next year, they improved even more. Domantas Sabonis was a full-time starter and was an all-star. Miles Turner was still really strong, and weirdly enough, he was only 23 at that point. It feels like he's been in the league for a very long time, and even at that point, it still felt like that. And he was only 23 in 2020. And then Bojan left to go to the Jazz, got that big deal from the Jazz, if you remember that. But TJ Warren was on that team, and TJ Warren, even outside of the bubble, had a really, really strong showing that season. I think he averaged 19 points per game on 50 from the field, 40 from the 3. He was really good, and especially in the bubble, he was really, really good. And it gave him enough time to allow Depot to come back, play the final 16 games of the regular season, and come into the playoffs. And they still lost in the first round, and I think a sweep, maybe 5 games to Miami, but they still showed a lot of potential with that roster. And they also added Malcolm Brogdon to that roster, who was going to be the point guard next to Victor Oladipo in that backcourt. Looking around, I mean, in the next year, Depot was, as I've already talked about, Victor Oladipo was not happy in Indiana. He was showing signs of not committing to re-signing, and that was the end of his time there. They included him in the James Harden deal and sent him off to Houston, and it was Sabonis, Malcolm Brogdon, and the TJ Warren, who I think suffered some injuries that year. And the Pacers hobbled away the 9th seed, and Sabonis gave him a really strong showing in the play-in against the Hornets, but it wasn't enough to get them past the Russell Westbrook-led Wizards to get them in the playoffs. Going into the next year, they were still trying to make things work with Sabonis, but then they were offered a deal by Sacramento. And as we all remember now, Indiana took it. A deal that would send Domantas Sabonis to Sacramento for Tyrese Halliburton, Buddy Hield, and Tristan Thompson. The Kings saw that, yes, Tyrese Halliburton was really talented, really good, showed scoring potential and playmaking potential, a lot of playmaking potential, but they didn't think him and De'Aaron were fitting well enough for them to be a playoff contender, and they were a joke of a franchise for a long time. So they thought getting another all-star to pair next to De'Aaron Fox and a guy that was showing more than Tyrese Halliburton had, who I disagree, would bring them a playoff contention. So they traded Tyrese, Buddy, and Tristan Thompson, like I said, for Sabonis, Justin Holiday, Jeremy Lamb, and a 2nd-round pick that would give them Sabonis and pair him next to De'Aaron Fox. And as we all remember, they made the playoffs the next year and were the beam team. And it was a special, special year. But outside of that, this trade at the time, I remember it being heavily scrutinized. Halliburton showed so much potential and talked about Sacramento as if it was the place he wanted to spend the next 20 years of his career. He was so excited to be there and loved the idea of being there. And he was and it was clear how emotional he was when he was traded. He wanted to be the future of Sacramento, and it shocked him. And it shocked the league. Another thing I should note, Indiana also was looking to rebuild entirely. So they, in that same deadline, traded Karis LeVert, a guy that was a part of that key rotation with Sabonis, Brogdon, and LeVert, and sent him off to Cleveland for a first, which turned into Ben Shepherd, Ricky Rubio, and a second-round pick that turned into their starting shooting guard and Andrew Nembhard. And at the time, wasn't believed to be that big of a trade and was giving Cleveland a really good score that didn't really work out with Indiana because of his injuries and just how the roster was constructed. And, well, I mean, you're seeing Nembhard now as their starting shooting guard in the NBA Finals. Okay, I should say now that this has nothing to do with the Paul George trade and the Serge Ibaka trade. Everything else has to do with it. But in the decision to trade Sabonis and go in on the rebuild, they kept Brogdon for the rest of the year, and in the offseason traded Brogdon to the Boston Celtics in a 5-team player swap. Actually, they just brought in 5 players. That included Aaron Nesmith, who is now also the starting small forward for that franchise, and one of the best players for the Pacers, and been one of the best players in the playoffs in general. And again, has nothing to do with all of this. But I should say that decision actually helped them make the decision to trade Brogdon as well and got a key player in their rotation. And as you can see here, this is the full transaction tree from the Paul George trade. And I'll try to find the link, whoever made this, and put it in the description down below. But this is it for the Pacers. He directly led to their construction for this finals team, a finals team that went in and beat the second best player in the world in the first round in 5 games. And then went in the second round against one of the best regular season teams of all time in the Cleveland Cavaliers and dominated them. I know the Cavs were hurt, but the Cavs got killed by the Pacers. And then went against the Knicks, who just beat the reigning champion Celtics and were up 3-1 on them, regardless of the Tatum injury or not, and just made it look too easy against them. The Pacers are a very competitive squad that have made move after move to build this roster over the last decade. After the Paul George trade, they built a competitive playoff roster with Victor Oladipo, Domantas Sabonis, Malcolm Brogdon, and then moving off of Depot for Karis LeVert. And then when things didn't work, they retooled, reshaped, rebuilt, and brought in this young guy in Tyrese Halliburton that not a lot of teams thought of, high of, because they thought either his jump shot form was weird, he was too tall and too wonky for good ball handling. They just didn't think he had the potential to be an all-star or an all-NBA player that he is. They thought he had a high floor. A lot of teams thought that, but they didn't think of the high ceiling, and he's showing that now. And you got to give the props to the Pacers, man. They have made move after move in the last decade. Okay, now that I've talked about how Paul George led directly to Indiana getting Tyrese Halliburton, the star of their team and the guy that has taken them to the NBA Finals, and then also getting Andrew Nembhard, who has been the key piece of that, and then the decision to go get Aaron Nesmith, but also not connected to this. Let's go back to Oklahoma City and our friends there. Well, Paul George went to Oklahoma City, and that first year with Russ and Oklahoma City just wasn't a great fit. It wasn't because of Paul George. I think he played a good year that year. I mean, he had his struggles here and there. Wasn't 22 points per game, 2.5 steals. He was a finalist for DPOY, or not a finalist, but top 10 for DPOY. Still one of the best 3-point shooters in the NBA. He can fit on any team in the league. It just, OKC wasn't a good fit altogether that year. Carmelo Anthony, Russell Westbrook, and Paul George just didn't really work. And the players around them just weren't that good. Especially after Andre Roberson went down, the defense alone outside of Paul George, it was boo-boo. It was buns. And Roberson had a really bad elbow injury. And they tried signing Corey Brewer to be the guy to fit that role. And I mean, Corey Brewer was older, and it just didn't really work. They lost in 5 games in the first round to Utah, a Utah team led by rookie Donovan Mitchell. And Paul George struggled very much so in that series past game 1. And after game 1, where he went off and they won the game 1, he declared playoff P. He was playoff P. But I mean, they got smoked in the next 4 games and got gentlemen swept. Moving on, Paul George was a free agent. He did not agree to a contract extension and didn't really look. He wanted to be a free agent in the first place. And there were rumors he would consider the Lakers going there, especially because LeBron was probably going to go there. And there was a lot of questions. Going into night 1 of free agency, Paul George actually said, I'm staying. We'll figure this out. I want to be with Russell Westbrook. I love the fit here. I love the people here. I love the fans here. And got a max contract from OKC. And at the time, a lot of people were happy for Russ because I think there were reports that were like, Russell Westbrook isn't friends with a lot of guys in the league, but Paul George is one of them. So there they were. OKC decided to retool the roster a bit, sent off Carmelo Anthony, brought in Dennis Schroeder to be the sixth man off the bench, who was really good for them. Trusted the development of some of their backup forwards to be the better defenders for this team. And Jeremy Grant, I think they just traded for Jeremy Grant. Terrence Ferguson, they traded for backup big Nerlens Noel. And they went to the year, and Paul George was a top guy for most of that season, was a finalist for MVP, and was actually one of the favorite at one point going into February. Paul George ended the year with a shoulder injury, though, that limited him in his play, especially going into the playoffs. And OKC struggled mightily against the Trailblazers in the first round of the playoffs. And if you remember, Paul George saying about Damian Lillard, I don't care what anyone says, that's a bad shot. You'll remember that for a reason. Because the shot Damian Lillard hit forced OKC into a rebuild. Paul George requested a trade, and we'll get to that in just a second. But yeah, it ended their season in the first round, and the Paul George experiment in OKC was over. And the most they could do was force a first round to go 5 games.
So what did the Clippers do so right that convinced Kawhi Leonard to sign with them?
Well, they traded for Paul George tonight, and they are sending to Oklahoma City essentially a record collection of draft picks, 4 first-round picks, 4 unprotected future first-round picks, a protected future first-round pick, 2 pick swaps, and outstanding rookie point guard Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari for Paul George.
So yeah, all of you know about the Paul George trade, but let me explain some of the details of it. SGA and Danilo Gallinari, of course. Danilo Gallinari had that year where OKC still made the playoffs and were, I think, the 6th seed in the West. And they had that 7-game series against the Rockets. SGA, of course, is now the MVP. J-Dub was the pick from the year that the Clippers missed the playoffs and were in the play-in against the Timberwolves, where Pat Bev, if you've seen the video, acts like he won the championship. Trey Mann, who was an important mention for, in just a second, Jaime Jaquez. Let me explain this situation. So the Miami first in 2023 belonged to the Clippers from the deal that brought in Jimmy Butler. And then the Clippers took it a few days later and sent it over in the trade for Paul George to OKC. Well, because Miami wanted to be able to retool some of the roster in 2022, they contacted OKC and said, hey, we would like to have our first back in 2023 so that we can have other tradable firsts around this time, and we'll give you a first later on. And OKC gave them that in return, and Miami said, here's our 2025 lottery protected first. And I think if they don't get it, it goes to 2026. So yeah. Then Dylan Jones, later pick of the first round of the 2024 draft, and a first round swap in 2025. I think they have 2 firsts this year, and then the 2026 first of the Clippers. Right now, OKC owns 4 firsts in 2026, by the way. A team that's in the NBA Finals owns 4 firsts in the following year's draft. Okay, now to mention Trey Mann. A fun thing that OKC did with Trey Mann is they let him develop for a few years and sent him off in the trade with Davis Bertans, who they took as a contract trade over because they had the cap space to do it, over to the Charlotte Hornets for Gordon Hayward to give them some depth off the bench and a guy that was having a strong year in Charlotte. And Gordon Hayward didn't really work out in OKC. They lost in 6 games in the second round of the Mavericks, and Gordon Hayward did not play in that series. And when he did, I don't think he was very good. And he badmouthed being on that team in the press conference after. I don't think he got signed the next year. With all that said, he was a free agent and was a lot of money and opened up a lot of money for OKC. And they used the money from the Trey Mann trade that brought him Gordon Hayward, that they freed up from Gordon Hayward being a free agent, for Isaiah Hartenstein, their starting center on their NBA Finals team. Another graphic I didn't make that I'll credit down below or do my best to. OKC also made move after move over the last decade to get to this point, taking Serge Ibaka and taking the smart deal and taking the assets of Victor Oladipo, former number 2 overall pick, Ersan Ilyasova, a really strong shooter, and then the draft rights to a top 11 pick in Domantas Sabonis, and then turned the 2 young assets into an all-star in Paul George, one of the best players in the NBA, and then got offered the deal when it was time to take apart the roster a deal that I don't think any NBA team in history would ever turn down. And at the time, everyone's like, how do you give up that much for Paul George? This this really, really good rookie point guard, all these picks, and then Danilo Gallinari, a guy that averaged 18 points the previous year. How do you take all of that for Paul George? And everyone at the time defended it with, it's Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, because Kawhi Leonard wouldn't have signed if it wasn't for this deal. And they're right. I think the Clippers do this deal again if it means that they get both those guys in return and get a conference finals appearance. I understand they didn't win a championship at the end of the day, but I mean, they still went to the conference finals for the first time. And besides all of that, they got to this point through move after move over the last decade and hoarded a lot of picks, and they still have so many picks over the next few years. And they have built one of the best defensive rosters of all time and went in the Western Conference and dominated the Ja Morant-led Grizzlies, even if they had a new head coach at the time. Took the 2 years off a championship Nuggets to 7 games and actually learned in that game 7 that how good they could be and their identity, and then went against the Timberwolves and beat them in 5 games. And they're one of 4 teams in NBA history to make the NBA Finals and the amount of games that they did. They have won so much up until this point. They have the most. They're in the top 4 of wins going into the NBA Finals in NBA history. The only other 3 teams that have done this are the 95-96 Bulls that broke the record for most wins in a season, the 96-97 Bulls, and then the 2015-2016 Warriors, who broke the record for the most games won in a regular season. We have never seen a team like this before. And they're young. They still have so many assets. They still have so many contracts to sign. But, man. And yeah, so that's how these 2 teams got to this point and were able to build championship-level rosters to make the NBA Finals. If I was to make a prediction today, I think I'm going to have Oklahoma City in 6 games. I just think this is a historic-level roster that goes 10-man deep. And when they are locked in defensively and when they understand their identity, they have been the best team in basketball all year long. And they were one of the best teams in basketball all last year. And I think they had a clear link last year. They really don't this year. Indiana also is a very, very good team. And I could see them forcing this and them winning this series by doing the impossible and defying the odds the way that they have all playoffs long. If you have stuck around this long, I appreciate that so much. I'm sorry I haven't dropped content in a long time. It's been a crazy, crazy, crazy year so far. And yeah, I'm really happy that you got to this point in this video. This is Son of a Sports. I'll catch y'all next time.